Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Legendarium podcast. I am your host, Craig Hanks, and I am here with an episode all about, well, I wanted to say sci-fi, but I think space opera is going to be the better term. We're going to dig into this term a little bit. I love episodes like this because it gives me a chance to take a term that I feel like I know, and then discover how much I don't know about it. Because I've got two guests with me, Sharon Lee and Steve Miller. How are you guys?
We're
great. We're doing good.
And this is you're a husband-wife team, right? Who's been publishing books together for when was the first one? What year did that come out?
Our first novel came out in 1988.
1988. So you guys have been doing this for a while. You've been around the block. You know the game. And you know all the terminology, like space opera. And before we turned the mics on, you said, I think Steve, it might have been you who said, well, you know, the term has changed quite a bit over the years, and my eyebrows were raised, and I'm thinking, wait, what? It has?
Oh yeah.
So let me start. And I should tell people we are going to talk about your latest offering. We'll do that at the end of the episode. They'll get to hear a little bit of a pitch about the latest thing to come out from you guys. But I do want to dive right into this subject, talk about space opera. Steve, was that you who said that?
Well, I think we both sort of leaned in that direction. So we had space opera came to us because we read the old books. And we enjoyed the ones that were not hard science. So we did things like Andre Norton, arguably space opera, where you had potential for interstellar universes and interstellar operations and governments and things left over from the galactic past and that kind of stuff. And space opera does cover some of that. It's now grown. It's now grown considerably, but
and it's gone through phases of being in bad odor. When we first when we first started, our first editor at Del Rey Books, apologized for calling our stuff space opera because that was a deprecated phrase at that point.
Right.
Because space opera was what was it, Perry Rodin and all the things that went on forever. So they were trying, and we were trying to move away from space opera at that point, and science fiction was going through one of its we're going to be literary now phases. Not necessarily the writers, but the people who are trying to guide the field. And space opera is fun, and you know why it's space opera, of course.
Well, actually, let's go back. Let's start kind of, I don't know about the beginning, but we can go back to, was the term in use before Gene Roddenberry came out with Star Trek?
Oh,
yes. Oh, yes.
Okay,
It was,
all right.
Gene Roddenberry's a newbie.
Yeah. Yell at me all you want. This is where I get my ignorance corrected. Bring it on. Okay, so where does the term start as far as you know?
Space opera, horse opera. Opera. It came from opera. Soap opera.
Sure.
Big stories, lots of emotion, silly plot threads. It's fun. Tragedy, human emotion. It all came from opera. And then so you have space opera, which is opera in space, and horse opera, which were westerns, and soap operas, which were, General Hospital and all the rest of that stuff that my grandmother used to love to watch. And we all have that history of telling stories about people.
And that's, okay. So opera being primarily about the people involved, not necessarily the setup or the setting around them, right?
So but often when the drama of what they're doing is very important. The exaggeration of an opera. This is an important thing. And horse opera came, of course, because of the movies. When there was this, suddenly in the 30s, there were all these movies that were horse operas. And somebody made a comment in a fanzine that Doc Smith was writing horse operas in space, in effect, and so it became space opera.
Okay.
And Doc Smith, of course, is was one of the field leaders with his Skylark of Valoron and the entire his entire conception of amazing galactic empires that could come to battle. So the battles after a while became too much for a lot of people, and the battles became were seen as overdone. And interestingly enough, one of the things that happened in later science fiction that we were fighting against when we started our own series is that later on, quote, sci-fi became sort of male oriented. And in the very first story that Doc Smith wrote, which had action adventure, and so, he tried to make sure he had a woman's viewpoint and had a female co-author so that they could not forget the romance and not forget because he thought that was important, having seen so many of the in effect He-Man situations where they wanted to
Sure.
where everything was about the intrepid pilot and his crew,
The
and
lone
Rocky
hero.
Jones.
Yes, Rocky Jones. And we can't when it became our turn, we said to each other as we were sitting down talking about what it is we want to write, that the lone hero is boring. Nobody is a lone hero. You have a family, you have partners, you have people that you interact with all the time. So the Liaden Universe is a vastly populated universe. There are a lot of characters, and they are connected. No one actually is the lone hero. They can't do what they've done without the support of the other characters.
Right, and that's where a story becomes dynamic, right? I suppose it can work in small doses. Every once in a while, you have your. I guess Conan the Barbarian wouldn't even be a great example. John Wick nowadays would be a
Yeah.
great example of the lone hero. But really, it's. I have this analogy that I often use when I talk about delivery systems, where you take a cereal like honeycomb. It's an okay cereal, but really it's just a delivery system for fresh cut strawberries.
Yes.
That's how I get my strawberries, right? To put them on the cereal, and and really sometimes these lone hero movies like John Wick that's just a delivery system for great action scenes.
Right.
Let's
Right.
be real. It doesn't have a ton of that human drama that we see when we start introducing other characters and relationships into the mix. So where does your personal history then come in with all this stuff? When were you introduced to science fiction and space opera, and what made you fall in love with it and say, I want to do that?
It's
Well,
back in the before times. You couldn't just read science fiction. You can do that now. You can just read in genre and never leave your genre. But you couldn't do that when we were starting to read. And this is, I'm talking when the paperbacks cost 15 cents, all right? And they were like 40,000 words. So you had to read in other places. I read science fiction, but I also read nurse books, for instance, and mysteries. And it came to me forcibly, I guess, as I was reading my way through that the science fiction stories I was reading could really use the nurse books, and the nurse books could really use the science fiction. They were approaching
What's
two
a
different
nurse book?
dynamics. A nurse book.
Yeah.
Oh, they were romances.
Ah,
And what would happen is the intrepid nurse would meet a wounded hero and nurse him back to health, and they would fall in love.
okay, got
or
it.
the doctor, or the ambulance driver, or the whatever. The important thing was the pathos of the situation of meeting somebody who's injured and going. It was a
Creating
very
a bond.
it was a
Okay,
very
sorry,
predictable thing.
I interrupted you because I just wanted to get that terminology down. But okay, so you wanted to bring those concepts from the nurse books into
into
science
science
fiction a
fiction,
little bit.
or the other way around. I always, I wanted to have adventures. I wasn't against having adventures. So anyhow, the peanut butter and the chocolate was fairly well mixed by the time I met Steve, I think.
Yeah, we both had very diverse reading backgrounds before we met, and I had started off with Andre Norton. I mentioned Andre earlier, and I also had been lucky enough to fall into ownership of a lot of pulp magazines as I was young, and the pulp magazines were the source for Doc Smith and hundreds of other writers who were writing action adventure. Remember, this is when television wasn't big. This is when people who wanted to
Television
do
went
something
off.
What?
not
Yeah.
10,
What years are we talking about? In the 60s or
the pulp
70s?
fiction was being written from 1915 to say 1945 or 1950,
Yeah.
and the thread goes from easily for us goes from Amazing Stories in 1926, call that the pulp fiction, and
Yeah.
uh, follows on along. And so, having come up with a bunch of these, at one point, Roger Zelazny gave me his magazine collection
Oh wow.
uh, when I was in college. So distracted from what I was supposed to be doing, but I read. So I had all of those. I had all of those to read too, and the point for both of us, I think, is that we had read other things too. You know, I read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea when I was in sixth grade, and but I also was reading some of the boys' books when I was in sixth grade because that was to hand, and I was reading a book or two a day.
Oh
That's what
wow.
I did. I we both had we both had that kind of a background, and so the of doing a lot of reading all the time. And so when I met Sharon, we both were familiar with the older fiction, and we were also familiar with some of the newer comers at that point. Anne McCaffrey had come along, and Roger Zelazny had come along. And Roger had a big influence on what we did in some ways because I knew Roger. I used to go fix his typewriters for him because he was hell on typewriters, and he would jam them up and stuff. And um, I had been at Rogers at one point, and he said, "You're not going to believe what's happened." And he said, "What?" And he said, "I got off the phone. I've sold 7 books at once."
Wow.
And that, of course, was the Amber series and his 9 Princes in Amber. So we came to the idea that we wanted not only to be able to write interesting stories about people, but that had relationships going on and things like that, but we also wanted to write in a universe. And Roger had complained of himself that he had set himself up a problem by having people expecting everything to come serially and
Hmm.
one after another, and which is why when we started doing what we were doing, we were looking at creating a universe so that we could play in the universe rather than having to have everything go this story, this story, this story, this story. That way lies madness, and this is why some of the old horse opera and the movie things got so strange is that you had to have a never-ending uh, increase of what was happening. So some of the science fiction stories that would start out with a boy and a gun and a spaceship. Next thing you know, he's part of an army. The next thing you know, he's part of a intergalactic core with spaceships behind him, and now they're doing time tunneling into another. But if you have to do that, and every time each story has to build on that serially, you get in trouble after a while. You run out of
We run out of things.
This is the problem that right now that the Marvel Cinematic Universe has run into. I don't
exactly.
know if you guys are keeping track of that, but I mean, I recently did a little live stream and talked with some of our listeners about that. But my whole thing, I should say, so sorry if this is a duplicate for a lot of people who have already watched that, but I kind of got off that train after they finished that first big saga, And I went, well, okay, that was a great ending. Thank you very much. And I tried the next thing that came out, and it was on TV. And if you guys are for anybody listening, minor spoilers for Loki. It was the Loki TV show that came out.
Mhm.
They're wandering through this interdimensional office space, and somebody opens a drawer, and here are all of the Infinity Stones. And Loki says, "Oh my gosh, are those Infinity Stones?" And he goes, "Yeah, we use them as paperweights." And it
Oh, we have so many of them.
and it completely invalidated all of the emotional input that I'd had in
Yeah.
this series for 10 years. They said, "Oh yeah, no, that's just a paperweight." And I went, "Well, never mind, I'm out."
Yes.
Because it's that, they have to always ramp it up. So I think I'm with you on that, Steve.
So
Um,
we decided to work in the larger thing, so we can take threads and whatever. But the focus of space opera, long about the time that David Hartwell came along, he wanted to take it away from the wild and woolly stuff to serious and important things, because he, as an editor, he wanted to do big important books, and he did a lot of big important books, but
Yes,
he redefined space opera to uh, to push out, in effect, to subdue the fun things in favor of the larger, most important ideas and stuff like that. And our whole thing, I come from a background. I got to work briefly with Damon Knight at one point, and one of his essences of what he was writing for the person's beer money. And he wanted to be giving the people the same stuff they got with their beer money, which was a good time.
I love that.
And that was one of his things. That was what, to him, that was what science fiction and the writing that was about.
Mm.
And
And
Sorry,
one of
go
the
ahead,
promises, one of the promises we made to each other as we were beginning to hone in on the Liaden Universe was that yes, we would write this, and if it stopped being fun for us, we would stop, because life is too short to do things you hate to do.
Ain't that the truth?
And here we are, 25 books in one series, and we're still having fun. And we get to write about, the last of the book we just turned in has a planet full of people with psychic powers. And what would that be like if you could just, open doors with your mind, and that was your whole, that you weren't, a mutant. This was how the culture was based. And the people who were unfortunately not psychic and who have to cross the room and open the door with the doorknob are considered to be handicapped people. They're not. They don't have all of their abilities. So that was kind of an interesting exercise, and space opera lets you do that.
So yeah, so if I understand the difference between the styles of storytelling you're talking about, there's that MCU constant ramp up, step after step after step.
right.
But then there's what you're talking about is if I dare bring up the name Gene Roddenberry again, but
No,
this idea, I'm kidding.
No, he did great
But
things. I love classic record.
The idea of creating the universe, and then every episode you get to go do a different thing on a different planet, and the adventures can be never ending. But there's also not necessarily what's the word I'm looking for? There's not a drive to constantly up the ante.
Right.
The drive is to find something different, not necessarily something bigger.
Interesting.
Okay.
And what Star Trek also did is that they had the crew. I mean, yes, Jim Kirk would throw off his shirt and run naked into the jungle at any moment, but there were a bunch of people working together. There wasn't just one guy.
Right.
So they did, and they see spreading the story out is much more interesting than just in my opinion, than just following one character or even one band of characters.
Everybody has their job, including those red shirts. You've got a job too, okay?
You've got a job to do, yes.
Yeah. See, the thing is that a lot of what you're talking about with Roddenberry comes from episodic TV, and that's how
sure.
that's how television had been had been done. And then J. Michael and some of these other people came along and said, hey, look, we can have story arcs, and nobody does story arcs. We can have all these threads where you've got to follow this, and this.
But we've been doing it in writing all the time. Over here in books, we've been doing story arcs for forever.
But the thing is that you have to be careful. Again, you have to be careful in how you build it. You lock yourself in if you make everything have to follow from the previous book exactly. This way, if we want to step off, the book that I'm working on right now took place several hundred years prior to the book that Sharon just finished up and said, here, I'm packing this off to the editor. So that's because that gives us how did we get here? It gives us the ability to go back and forth and to spread and to look at things from different. We have a whole series of stories that happen to be about a bakery.
And this was the fault of an editor who asked us to write a Christmas story. Now, the Liaden Universe, we don't have Christmas in the Liaden Universe. So basically, I took that as my assignment was to write a Hallmark story.
Oh, nice.
For their Christmas page, for their December page, they do a story every month. And so we wrote a story about a baker who, this guy just shows up on a block, and he's got a bunch of kids, and he connects with the neighbors, and they're starting. This is a scene, and they're starting to work together. And we handed in the story and waiting for what on earth is this? But that didn't come. That was like, oh, this is perfect. So that was good. But then we looked at each other and said, well, that was all very good, but who are these people? And we had to write another story to figure out where they came from.
And then
so no, go ahead, Steve.
No, that's just that's how these things grow for us. We've been lucky enough to pick up readers over the years, and there's who come to us on the internet or at conventions and say to us, "What about this? What about this?" And one of the characters was and shows up in passing, I think, in the bakery thread. But one of the characters was a taxi driver, and we wrote a novel. And this taxi driver is on about 8 paragraphs in this novel. And we go to a convention and people start, what happened to the taxi driver? So that's a driving force there as a character. But the universe is big enough that the taxi driver can be important. And so can somebody working on the docks. And so can the person who is in charge of the starship.
You might even call it a taxi driving force.
There you go.
Thank you. All right. So the question now, Steve, is so what happened to the taxi driver? What?
He wrote a short story about her. Well, made a long short story about her.
I wrote a long short story about her, but what happened at first is she drove one of the quote-unquote side characters who was only going to be in that one book for one scene, and he's ended up in about 15 books and is a major.
But he's still a side character.
He's still a side character, yes, he is. And she drove him to a mansion, and she's driving this guy to the mansion from the spaceport, and he says, "You've got to take me here." And she's looking at it. Are you expected? And he said, I'm going here. And she said, okay, you're going here. And then he says, wait for me. And she looks at him and said, no, 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 no. If you're expected here, you will not need a taxi to come out.
And so there was wait around.
Talk about threat.
You will not be needing a taxi. And so what ended up happening is that she became involved by necessity in an attack on that planet. Because after all, she had a taxi and she was mobile and etc. So
help move equipment and people.
And so she grew into that, and she's still with us now, 14 books later or something.
Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing. So it's discovery writing over decades, basically, just letting things come to you. That's great. I remember my favorite discovery writing example was Tolkien writing a letter to somebody saying that when he wrote the Hobbits to Bree, and then there was this guy sitting in the corner smoking a pipe with his hood down. And he says, I don't know who that is, but I need to find out. And that's
Yep.
where Aragorn comes from. And you never know where stuff like that is going to take you. So that's fun. 14 books of taxi driver involvement. That's fabulous. So I've got a question for you. You guys have been in the game now for 35-ish years, since the first Liaden book came out. And I want to ask you about changes over time in, in a few different areas, but the one that's kind of tickling my brain right now is following on this thread of the person that comes up to you in the convention and says, "What happened to the taxi driver? I got to know." We call these people, and by these people I mean ourselves, thank you very much, nerds. If we define a nerd as somebody who gets really obsessed with one thing and they learn all the minutia and they get very involved mentally and emotionally with this one specific thing. So, Star Wars nerds and Tolkien nerds, whatever else. Has that concept gotten stronger or weaker in the last few decades from what you can detect? Are fans more or less nerdy about things? Or is this just a human tendency that, we get to indulge in our fabulously wealthy culture? We get to indulge our nerddom, and we just kind of shift what we're nerdy about.
Can I ask you a question? The question is, do you know who Forey Ackerman is?
No.
Okay, you don't know Forey Ackerman. See, Forey Ackerman was involved in like the famous monsters, the famous film magazines, and all of that. Forey Ackerman was a fan.
Forrest Ackerman.
That name. Ackerman. Yes, that Forey. that Forey Ackerman, who wrote me a letter at one point and signed it 4E.
Really?
Yeah, he was 4E Ackerman, 4 and an E. 4E.
Nice.
Okay, so Forey Ackerman was a fan.
So that's our bench right there, our benchmark for
nerd. We start back in the 1930s with fans. You want this nerd is a new concept because fans were fans. They started off.
Fans came from fanatic.
Sure.
Okay.
And so fanatic equals nerd. Sure, we can go there. And the thing is that I mentioned Doc Smith and the Skylark of Valoran and his rings. You're familiar with the 1, 2, 3. He had almost magical jewels, except that they were science. That people could wear and look into the jewel and thus do mind reading and do all these other kinds of things. He wrote a series of books, and he wrote his first one or two, and then fandom discovered him, or he discovered fandom, and he went to conventions and people gave him story ideas. And he could sit in a room and people would talk to him and he'd get his story ideas from them and he reflected what they wanted. And that was part of what was going on. And that's from that era too. So we're now talking the late 20s, 30s, and even into the 40s for him. So no, I can't. I would say that nerdier is not necessarily true. And the range of who can be nerdy. We have a book, an important book that shows up as part of our series, and that book is a code of proper conduct. Okay, so
it is more than a book. It's like the Oxford English Dictionary. It's
well, yes, and people are supposed.
There's a whole committee that takes care of it and updates it and things. So.
Okay, so you're supposed to know this if you happen to be a Liaden. You're supposed to know this backwards and forward because somebody can stab you in the face if you do something wrong that's not in that book. So about 5 books in, we got a letter on lawyer stationery from a lawyer explaining to us that one of our people had acted out of code.
Oh wow.
Yeah, right. He had done something that was not to code. And I'm sitting here reading this letter, and we wrote back to him and said, "Listen, we are making this up as we go along, and if you have a copy of the Liaden Code of Proper Conduct, send it to me because I have a need for it." And he wrote it. He wrote a very gentle apology that he had
and and and,
misunderstood.
uh, and eventually we had actually found the place where Sean Yosgalan was exonerated from having done something wrong. But it
He
really
did.
was
He meant to do that. Yes.
um, it took close reading of 3 chapters to find the particular line that proved he had done it right. And obviously, we've got 4 million or 6 million words out there right now. We cannot go back through every one of them and make sure we've got it right this to that degree each time. But the stories were catching people, and so if that's a nerd, yeah, that's a nerd. Okay,
Yeah.
fine, and
And
it's
we
still there, but it was back for Fari Ackerman too.
we depend on our fans, on our readers, because I don't have time to constantly reread our body of work in the Leaden Universe. Because we're still under contract, so we have books to write. And if I have forgotten something, like a particular character's surname, or did we ever say that Ginobili was a master trader, or is he just a trader and a counselor, I will go on to Facebook and say scavenger hunt.
Oh, nice.
I need to know this thing. And there are people who know this and who know where to find it. And those very same people started a Liaden Universe wiki on the web, which is voluminous. There's all of the details you ever want to know about the Liaden Universe. And that's completely a volunteer and a fan effort.
So
So
that's nerdy, I guess.
yeah, yeah. I guess you're crowdsourcing your beta reading or your what's oh I work with Brandon Sanderson and he employs a continuity specialist.
Right.
It's somebody who
Okay, yeah.
keeps his
Mhm.
entire archive of information and facts about characters and events and places.
Nora
Um,
Roberts has a person whose job is to keep the database
there you
of
go. Yeah,
many
exactly.
things. I was on a panel with her, and they were explaining she was explaining how she did it, and everybody else on the panel could have fallen on their swords. I think when I explained, no, we ask our fans.
We ask our fans, or it's in our head. The wrong answer is it's in my head.
So do you feel? And I know we're kind of diving into this a different rabbit hole now, but hey, this is the Legendarium, and we go on tangents. That's what we do. Um, but how much do you worry about continuity and that sort of thing when you're 20, 30 books in and you're going, yeah, sure, that happened in book 4, but I only learned about it later and I don't really care that much.
No,
Or
no,
is
no,
it
no,
really
no, no.
important to you to try to get things
You
really,
have to care. You have to
you
care.
have to care?
If you don't care, people will notice.
Mm,
If you haven't written something because you really want, if you hate something when you write it, people will notice when they read it.
And there's 2 sides to that. Part of it is that caring is part of how we can look at find a character and say, oh, we talked about this person. Maybe we can use this person from back there. Sometimes we do need to go and do a scavenger hunt to have somebody say, in what book did this happen? So we can go back and check. But not only do we have the 26 books now we're working on, where we turned in the
Yes,
26.
26 books got turned in.
Okay. So not only do we have that, we have 5 collections of short stories worth 600,000 or 800,000 words of short stories and things that have taken place. So there's a lot of things have happened, and we do try to make sure that we don't cross a boundary. Very early on in our experience with the Liaden Universe, we also were running a computer bulletin board, and I had somebody try to take over a game by putting one of our characters in this online game, and then turning him in rogue. And I blew the entire
The whole
thing
thing.
off the web. I just said no. I took the game down and said and explained that this character has got to be available for us to work with. And if you start putting these things into somebody else's head, that's going to change the general thing. So we're very serious in that regard, and we do try to keep the stories consistent. We might miss an occasional thing. I mean,
We do a lot with misdirection. Something can be said in book 4, which is ambiguous. And in book 15, we go, you know what that meant? It didn't mean the straight read, it meant the crooked read. And you can springboard from that. But it still has to be logical.
yeah, Lois.
You can't just say, forget everything we said in book 4. We don't believe that anymore.
Lois McMasters Bugeaud had said at one point the author can have a better idea
Yes.
about something that happened in one of her books. And she said, the author can have a better idea. And that's true to some extent, but the massive retconning that goes on in Marvel and in some of these things, no, you've got to be, well, for us, it's worked at by being true to the characters. We're trying to work with characters. And when you do that, we act like we're little gods. Spinoza did the God acts out of the necessity of his own being, so that God can't do something.
Miracle.
Yeah, so miracles don't happen if you believe in if you have a sense of what Spinoza's doing. Going back the other way, we feel that our characters each act out of the necessity of their own being, and this is why the taxi driver picked up a fandom, because the character wasn't just there and placed there because we needed a red shirt, but because the character was there because this is what she did, this is what she wanted to do, and this is how she
knew her route.
things.
She knew her route, and she knew that usually people who wanted to go to Trielefantral, the gate was barred. The gate was barred. That was her experience, and this guy is saying, no, I'm going there. I'm expected.
And
this will be interesting.
And she shows up, and the gate opens for her, and it's like, whoa, this is something. So, but that's out of the necessity of their own being. And not because we needed that character there. The character ended up there because that was the right person for the thing. And it's so that consistency.
I was just on a panel with Keith R.A.D. And Keith said something very wise, which is there are no throwaway characters. All characters are important to someone. So that he was using it to justify introducing you to people who were red shirts, who were going to die, and giving you a little bit of an insight into them before he killed them. Because the death has to count for something. It's not just a plot device. If you're going to pay attention to the story and pay attention to the people in the story, this death has to matter to you.
Have you ever run across a situation where, okay, so maybe not the taxi driver, but maybe somebody else, a character that you wrote that that the fans ended up investing more in than you had originally? That's not to say you didn't care about them at all when you wrote them, but you thought, okay, this is the purpose that they'll serve, and then it morphs into something else and turns into something completely different because of what you perceive as the fan reaction to it.
Wow, that's kind of complicated.
Yeah, I know that's a tough question.
No, I'm serious. It is complicated, and over time we've been able to get a lot of fan reaction. Facebook has three different.
Many characters. We have so many characters that people tend to invest in certain groups of characters. There's an arc, the Theo arc, and people invest in Theo and her crew. And there's the Valkanimiri arc, which started with Agent of Change, and people want to follow Valkanimiri. So sometimes people are disappointed because they've gotten Sean and Priscilla in a book, and they really wanted another Theo book. But people, back again, you're a fan of what you're a fan of. then whoever catches your interest, of course, your favorite, you want more of them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there you go. Hey, I was just curious. But okay, so let's do this. Steve and Sharon, authors of the Liaden series, what do we call it? The Liaden Universe.
It's the
The
Liaden Universe.
There you go. That's what I thought. Um, I I feel like we've talked about it enough that hopefully somebody who's going to be intrigued has had enough to ping their pleasure centers and get them intrigued and want to go check out this series if they haven't yet. I was telling you before we started the microphones, I know that I read one of these a long time ago, so long that it doesn't even count at this point. But I wanted to ask you this. If someone wanted to check out the Liaden universe, do they start at book one and then read through, or where do you like to point people as an entry point these days?
What usually happens is someone says, "Where do I start? I don't want to, 26 books is too much."
It's
I
a
say,
lot, yeah.
What do you like to read?
Mm-hmm.
What do you like to read? If you like Regency romances, for instance, you want to start with Local Custom and Scout's Progress. Two easy ways into the Liaden universe. If you like action and adventure, you want to start with Agent of Change, which happens to be the first one. If you like stories about traders, you want to start with Conflict of Honors, maybe, or maybe with Jethry Goblin. Jethry has 4 or 5 Steve books.
Yeah. I think
that you
we're
can read.
5. Yeah.
5. So you can read all about the trade side. If you like, if you just want to sample a standalone, I'm guessing Necessity's Child, which gives you a flavor for the characters and for the culture, the several cultures that are clashing in that one, and the movement of the story.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of reading Pratchett when I first was introduced to Terry Pratchett, and I said, "Well, where do I start?" And they said, "Well, what kind of book do you want to read? Try
you can
this
read Death,
trilogy."
you can read The Guards, you can read, and in general, really, because of how books work, you can pick up a book and start reading it because books work by telling you the story as you go on, and it should give you enough backstory that you're not totally lost.
Yeah.
Having read more in the series should only enrich the book, but it shouldn't. But a new reader shouldn't be completely lost by picking up any book.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Okay. Well, I feel like we got a shotgun with a bunch of recommendations, which I love. So what I'm going to do is link to those in the show description or the show notes so people can check that out. I know that many of our listeners are immersed in the Liaden universe. That's great. But if you haven't tried it yet, then try one of those titles that I will link to in the description. All right. Any parting thoughts on your experience with space opera, writing it, consuming it? Is there any parting wisdom you want to throw our way before we head out for the day?
Parting wisdom.
Well, we're hoping that we're getting readers who read to enjoy, and who read to enjoy, to relax. We hope you're not invested in every book, having to reveal the extreme secrets of life, because that's not what we're writing. That's not why we're writing. We're writing for fun, and we're writing for an adventure that you can walk away from, and that's part of the joy of being able to deal with these kinds of books, and that's what we hope our readers are finding, and that's the reactions we get from most of our readers. Yes, sometimes there are serious things discussed. Yes, there are points that when you look at it later, somebody says, "Oh my God, I never realized you had that in there." Okay, that's cool. That means it worked for us, and it worked for them too. But we don't start off with the books aiming at this is what somebody has to take away from this. No, that's not what we're doing.
We say things. We say things over and over again. People are people no matter what they look like. We say that a lot in the Liaden universe. For instance, we deal with AIs. We deal with different cultures. But that's not the point of the book. I mean, the point of the book is to have fun.
There you go. I dated somebody once who told me, she says, I want to be casual with my time, but not necessarily my feelings.
Yes.
And I loved that formulation. I thought, oh, that's really interesting. So, you don't want to devote 100% of your time to this, but that doesn't mean you're not going to enjoy it, feel something,
Mhm.
that sort of thing. Does that ring pretty true then?
Yes, to
Yes.
be engaged, to be engaged.
There you go.
We write escapism, and that means that we're giving you a chance to escape your daily life and the roof leaks or whatever's going on. Your boss is a jerk, and sit there and read about somebody else's problems for a while, and not be drained or exhausted when you get to the end of it. You should be happy when you finish a Liaden book.
I love that. I love that. I think there is a place in the world for the other type of story, versus what you're talking about. That it has its place, but we can't just constantly consume ultra heavy stuff all the time, right? So
Right.
No,
I
no
love having
dystopia.
no.
Say no to dystopia.
Sometimes, so
Sometimes.
often I do. Sometimes I don't. But Steve Miller and Sharon Lee, thank you so much for taking a little bit of time today to chat with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
for having
you.
us.
And for everybody else, like I said, go check out the show notes for the links to the Liaden Universe books that we've mentioned here. And then also make sure you go to thelegendarium.com where you can find past episodes, future episodes on the calendar. You can find a contact sheet so that you can ask me about the meetup that we're doing in Salt Lake City next February. So everybody should go check that out, as well as the links to Patreon and Discord where you can join the conversation. Once again, thank you to my guests, and especially thank you to everybody for listening. I will see you next time.